All right. Thank you for being here. Ellen Butler, writer, researcher. I was looking for another word for mystery writer, and it came up with synonyms like thriller, riddler, problem. But I like problem solver. So
Mhm.
I'm going to go with that. Where do you think that stories originate?
It's funny, all sorts of different places, for me, at least. I can tell you a couple of different ones, and I always like to share some of this in the back of my book. I write a little bit of what the inspiration was, but for instance, I have a book, a Karina Cardinal mystery, and it's called Fatal Legislation, and that one came about because I heard an ad for a recall for pacemakers. And I thought to myself, why are we recalling pacemakers? And I called up some of my folks who work in cardiovascular, and they said, oh, well, they can go haywire, they can be hacked. And I said, oh, hacking a pacemaker. I'm
Wow.
going to have to kill off someone that way in a book. So in the first chapter, I kill off a senator by hacking his pacemaker.
Goodness.
And
I wonder why they built in a thing where you could hack a pacemaker.
Well, when they started building in, I don't know if you know some of the more newer, fancier, upgraded materials that we put in our bodies. Like doctors can see them on phones or websites or whatever. So that information is being transmitted somehow, not through a wired service. So pretty much anything with software can be hacked from what I was talking with them. I have a friend in the FBI who works in the cybercrimes division, and we talked about it a little bit as well, and it was really disturbing, actually, how much information came out for that book as far as the capabilities that hackers do have to get into all of our information. And I kind of feel pretty unsafe when it comes to my information being out there in the black market, on the dark net, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's something to look into when you're getting something like a pacemaker installed is that Bluetoothed and who has the information to that and how they track it, and can you get an older one that doesn't have that? Hmm.
Yeah, well, they patched it. Obviously, they had it and they patched it and everything like that. But still, and actually, I had a girlfriend whose husband, he was on the wait list for a new heart, and he was wearing a pacemaker until that came through. And he did have a problem with his pacemaker. It started going too fast, and she told me exactly what happened and how he looked, and he just kind of passed out in front of her, obviously completely freaked out. Luckily, he did end up getting his heart, but I actually used her information in the book as to what happened to my senator when I hacked his pacemaker.
Wow. Okay.
So,
Yeah, that's the realistic angle to it.
right. And it's funny when you mentioned, another word for mystery writers, I tell people, well, I think of ways to kill people and bury the bodies,
So just a regular person.
just average shit.
Yeah. Everybody has those plans, or you should, and maybe have one or two people you can call if it ever happens, although it's easier just to keep it between yourself. Hmm.
Yeah.
This will
Yeah.
be used in court.
I know, right? It is easier if you don't tell anybody, but if you have a do or die girlfriend, then, she's got to bring the shovel.
Yeah. Hmm. So then, if stories originate with like occurrences and stories that you've heard or seen, how much do you think comes from any other places, like wishes or hopes or dreams or whatever?
Well, um, I think when I started out writing actually in romance, and I think at that time, um, I was writing because it drew me to the lighter side of reading and enjoyed the romantic, and you always know that there's a happily ever after. But what I came to realize after writing about, I think I wrote 5 romances before I shifted into the mystery suspense thriller genre, because I also wrote romantic suspense, and I just realized that I enjoyed writing that suspense aspect of it more than enjoyed writing the happily ever after. And for instance, my Karina Cardinal character, she has a number of relationships, so her love life kind of goes up and down, dips and sways. I think a
Mm.
little more realistically sometimes than our happily ever after romances. So I don't know if that was a hope or what it was. as far as writing the romance, but I just enjoyed having those happily ever afters um, come to fruition. I think I enjoyed writing that. But like I said, with the mysteries, they just are, I don't know, come to me in a far more interesting fashion. The one that's releasing on October 2nd, as a matter of fact, um, came to me. It's called Ink and Intrigue at Ivy Tree Inn. And that one actually came to me a little bit when I watched a Grace Kelly movie. I'd come across a 1950s old magazine. I think it was a Ladies' Home Journal or Look magazine, and it had Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier on the front. And I started reading about her, her romance with the prince and what it really meant, and decided to kind of incorporate that a little bit I was looking at writing kind of an Agatha Christie style mystery where we have an inn, somebody dies, and everybody's a suspect. And I wanted to write that really tight in, somebody there at the inn is going to be the murderer. But I had this little bit of reason, like, how am I going to get my character there, who's a journalist, and she works for Ladies Lifestyle magazine, which would be your, Ladies Home Journal. And so she goes up to interview a starlet who was getting married to the Prince of Maldinia, you know, that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
then and I knew who I wanted to murder in the book, and I'm not going to tell you who that is because that's a little bit of a mystery unto itself. But I also wanted to do something a little bit different in the creativity, in the fact that when you're reading in the first person, you're reading from my main character. Her name is Ariadne Winter, and she's my journalist. But also throughout the book, chronologically, we go in a timeline and continue, but we do see at least one chapter from each of the suspects. So you get into your head a little bit. You hear, you kind of get a little bit of a sense as to what their motivation for killing this person is. And then I also put my character, my journalist, nearby, listening at keyholes or, just around, kind of eavesdropping. So she also hears or sees things that eventually she puts together to solve the crime. Um, and so that's kind of how that came from seeing this Grace Kelly movie and this magazine that I saw. And the next thing we're hosting a murder mystery at an inn in Newport, Rhode Island.
How much do you use timelines in your writing, and how do you use it?
Well, especially when I started writing in the mystery and thriller genre, when I wrote in the romance genre, I always had characters at a conflict. I had an idea of where the story was going to go, and I kind of panstered those. You've probably heard of panstering and plotting. And pansters are people who don't really plot and they just head into a book. And that's the way I started in romance. But when I started writing in the mysteries, the timeline became very important. I had to start plotting because when I first started trying to panster my first mystery, it wasn't working out for me. I was taking
Mm.
too long. I had to keep going back. I was like, oh, I got to drop a clue here. I've got to put a red herring there. And it was a mess. And so I started plotting, and from that plot, especially with the Ink and Intrigue book, we start. I tell you, every day that it turns. So we start on a Monday, and then we go through the week, and our murder happens during the week, and then she has until the weekend to wrap it up because she has to be back to work on Monday in New York.
Yeah, you got to have a plan.
Yep.
With timelines, then, if you're doing a historical fiction versus a
Mhm.
romance versus a mystery, how much more do you use a timeline, and how much more research is involved for a historical fiction versus a mystery?
Well, so for the historical fiction, because I've got two historical spy novels, and they did take me a lot of research time. For the first one is a World War II, and I wanted to do it right because it was important to me. I don't know if you've ever chatted with folks who are very into World War II, like reenactments and that sort of thing, and they know everything. They know timelines, they know people and places, they know how uniforms should have looked, the weapons that they used. And that sort of thing. So I did about 2 years worth of research for that book. It's called The Brass Compass, and because I also my main character is a spy, is a female spy. She's an OSS agent behind enemy lines, And I wanted to, and I did a lot of research on troop movements and everything, so that when I put her where I put her, that's the action, and that's what was happening during the war. Um, because basically her cover gets blown and she doesn't have a way out because she doesn't know who she can trust. And so she's kind of on her own trying to get out of the country and trying to basically get into Allied hands before the Nazis get to her. So that was a lot of research. And I interviewed, luckily, I got to interview a couple of veterans. I interviewed a gentleman who lived in Berlin, was half Jewish, was co opted into one of Hitler's work camps, got away, hid out in his father's apartment, and survived the war. And he actually was one of my best interviews in giving me an idea of what it felt like to be in Germany during that time. And so I think it's important in historical fiction to do your research. The second one I did was takes place in 52. It's called Operation Blackbird, and at that time, where it's no longer Nazis, it's communism, and it takes place in Berlin, Germany, East West Berlin, and we're helping um, a Soviet defector escape from East Berlin into West Berlin. Because a lot of people, I don't know if everybody knows, but the Soviets were constantly watched by the KGB. There was an entire division of KGB to watch their people, like a secret police to watch their own people. And
Mhm.
so, and it was inspired by a real Soviet defector by the name of Grigory Tokaty, who actually defected in the hands of the British in 47. Um, and he was the inspiration. And I took a lot of things that we know about his life, but we don't actually know how the defection happened because they've never released that information. We just know it did happen. And he actually ended up consulting on he was a rocket scientist and ended up consulting on the Apollo project here in the
Mm.
United States. And he ended up being a teacher in Britain. So I think it's valuable to make it realistic for the reader to do your research, but I also think you need to make sure not to allow the research to overplay in the book because I think then it can get boring if you're just into too many research details. You got to keep that, the research has to help the storyline move forward. And I have read books, unfortunately, that are historical fiction from authors that I absolutely love, but sometimes I find that they do get bogged down. They get caught up into that. There's so much interesting research they want to stick in there that it bogs the storyline down. I don't know.
Yeah,
What do you think? What's your feedback on that? Any
I
thoughts?
found you do a lot of research
Hmm.
anytime you're writing. More so, I would think for mystery, you have the classic writing research of how does this thing happen? What would be the realistic way for this to unfold? And then you also have that in your historical fiction because you're still writing a story. And
Hmm.
then on top of that, you have the overlay of history. So it's timelines. I really like timelines. And as I've talked about before, I wish I had understood the use of them when I was much younger because I think through school, I would have used them a lot more just to get the bigger picture of everything together, where
Hmm.
you could be studying or learning about prohibition and different wars and all these things. But when you put them together, like on a piece of paper and look at it, then you can go, wow, that's what was going on at this time. That's why the roaring 20s were the roaring 20s. That's because of prohibition and because of the influenza. People were,
Hmm.
that they were tapering off all the dying then, and people were happy to be alive. So
Right.
I like the way that timelines work, not just to keep things straight, but also when I write a historical fiction, I'm trying to weave the story into it to where somebody could look at it and go, wait, did this really happen?
Hmm.
If you're talking about events. And that takes a little bit more, but it also takes the restraint of not putting in all the research. You just have to accept as the writer, you're going to know a lot more about history than maybe the person reading, unless they're interested and they go look it up. And then just like you would know more about any story that you wrote. If somebody talked to you about a story you wrote and said, well, I wonder what this person was doing at this time, you've probably thought about that. You might have some stuff written down about it, but rarely would you have a time where you're like, oh, I don't know what that person was doing. I just dropped them in there. You don't just drop people in. So I like timelines. Do you use like a physical timeline? Do you write it out? Do you have it on a computer screen? Do you put it on a piece of paper on the wall? How do you keep track of all those things?
So when I'm plotting, I do tend to put it in for every story. I get a new spiral notebook, paper, spiral paper notebook, and I start. That's where I start. I start with my characters. I start like who they are, what their physical characteristics are like, what their names are. And I put research into names too, trying to decide, what's their ancestry, how did they
Oh,
get
yeah.
this name, when were they born, what was a popular name during that time. One of the things that really irritates me, sorry, I'm going on a tangent here for a minute, but one of
Do
the
it.
things that really
Do it.
irritates me in historical fiction is when people don't use names from that time period and they're using a modern day name. Like if you're going to throw in Kaylee for a 1920s book, you're pulling me right out of that genre.
Yeah.
Um,
And names matter.
yeah, right. And so I do research on, I will do a search on a certain website that I use for generating names, like how old is my person? What's the date? So they were being named like in the 1910s or in the 1920s or whatever. So what were popular male? What are the top 100 popular male names during that time period? And then what's their ancestry? So would they have given? Are they Irish? Would they have given them an Irish name, or whatever their ancestry is, or why the parents might have given them a particular name? Was it a family name? That sort of thing. So, but back to the plotting and
Timelines. Yeah.
yeah, in the timeline. I do plot on a in my spiral notebook. So as I plot, I also do create the timeline in there. It's on paper, and sometimes I scribble and scratch. I mean, it's a mess because not only do I during that time when I'm writing the book, do I have the spiral notebook for my characters and my plot and my research. Like if I'm interviewing or anything, I'll do the interview right there in the back. But I also tend to have it around all the time. So it's got like phone numbers, messages from phones, and things like that. And it's funny because I'm like, oh, I'm looking for a phone number. What was I writing that during that time? So I'll get out that spiral notebook and flip through and be like, oh, okay, this was the doctor's name and phone number from back when I was writing this particular book. So it kind of becomes a Bible that I carry around for that time period while I'm writing the book. But yes, I do tend to plot on on a piece of paper the timeline of when things are going to happen in my days, because sometimes I have gotten like out of a chapter or something. Luckily I've got a wonderful editor who she's caught it in the past. She's been like, hey, okay, you're off a day somehow. I'm going to fix this, because when one time I rearranged some chapters and I forgot to kind of rearrange the timeline along with
Mm.
it. But
Hmm.
luckily she caught it. She's like, something's wrong here. She went in and fixed it. Thank heavens for editors, right? I wouldn't do a book without one.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the timelines. I liked it for learning. I like it for teaching, and
Hmm.
definitely like it for writing. There are times when if I have 2 or 3 storylines going on at the same time, or one that's beginning when another one's ending, then I look at the story arc of it, the classic peak and down, and then I put the other storylines over it just in different color lines, and you end up with a more artistic view of what a timeline is. But it in color, it shows you how the stories are picking up and dropping off during your book. And if you're doing a series, it helps too because you can put them all together. But that's interesting. That gets a little into the what I would call the art side of it, where you're going to start doing paintings and things. But it's interesting how the art of writing and the art of drawing meet.
Exactly. That's an interesting way to put it. You said that you taught. Do you teach history or?
I, I taught in Virginia Beach, actually, in the the brick and mortar campus of what was then University of Phoenix. I'm not sure if it's still there,
Mhm.
but back in like 2012, 2011 timeframe, was teaching some police classes because I was
Okay.
a trooper down there at the time, and like police history, police ethics, things
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm.
But the timelines help because each class you could put down what you covered the class before over a I started with world wars or just conflicts, US conflicts, other things going on at that time, and then would fill in other notable events like prohibition, like different pandemics or whatever,
Mhm.
just things that would change the way you saw the world back then, other than
Right.
just looking at it for a single incident. And then you put things over it, like when law enforcement started, Sir Robert Peel and the Bow Street Runners, on up through modern policing. But yeah,
Mhm.
timelines.
It's interesting that you talk about the history of the police force and that sort of thing. In this latest novels, Ink and Intrigue at Ivy Tree Inn, I wanted to add some diversity, even though it takes place in Newport, Rhode Island, which at the time in '58 was not a very diverse place because most of the African American small population that they do have in Rhode Island lived in Providence. However, I decided to make the police detective an African American gentleman. And when I was doing research to see when they had actually, when the Rhode Island State Police had actually hired their first black man, it was 10 years later, actually almost 11 years later, in the late 60s. And
Mhm.
so I'm early, obviously in '58. I'm early, and I realized that I'm going to cop to it. But I wanted to bring him in, and it's interesting. The gentleman who was the first one, so he was actually a Marine in I think Korea, and then went into the police force. He spent a couple of years. He only spent 2 years there, and then he moved on to, I think it was ATF. I'd have to look at my notes, but on to work for the federal government at the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department. Um, and he had a very interesting story from the few articles that I could read. But I thought it was interesting too that they didn't have a black man in the department until that time period. And then I'm not quite sure when they hired another one after him because like I said, he was only there he went through the training and then he was only there for 2 years. And there seemed to be indication that he did find some difficulties while he was there. So I give a little bit of those difficulties and kind of prejudice in the book itself, display a little bit of that from some of his colleagues. So,
Yeah. Providence. I did a half Ironman in Providence, Rhode Island,
mm,
because I thought it was going to be flat. And the description of it said rolling hills, and I was like, "Oh, rolling hills will be easy. You can run on that, ride a bike on that. That'll be okay." And then they said protected waters. And when we got there, the morning of it, or when we are going to the start, they all the buoys had been blown around because there was some sort of storm, and then they gave you the option of not doing the swim. But I was like, no, you got to do the swim. I mean, but it was like ocean waves. It was 6 foot
yeah.
waves, and
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
so you go do the swim, and then the biking was
Wow.
there were huge hills. There were huge hills, and then running in downtown Providence by Brown University,
Hmm.
that is on a ridiculous hill.
Yeah, that's
Like,
that's not just hilly.
yeah, and it was a 2 7 mile loops, and you had to go up and down that hill twice.
Oh my goodness. That was a hard one for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I did it in a little less than 8 hours, a half Ironman, and then the professionals were doing it in 4 hours.
Hmm.
But I
Okay.
didn't fall on the bike and I finished, so that was good. But Providence, not what I thought it was going to be. And
Yeah, my
then,
parents I'm sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
My parents did live in Rhode Island for about 10 years, and it's a beautiful, beautiful state. Lots of interesting places. I did enjoy going down to Providence, and um, we saw some concerts there, and they had the beautiful area along the river. So it was really nice.
Yeah, it reminded me of Richmond a little. So Richmond,
Hmm.
Virginia. So I guess that's just cities on rivers.
I
It is a
agree.
little more hilly, but yeah.
So how did you do in that race?
I wasn't allowed from first. It was okay. I survived it.
Okay.
Yeah. Everybody gets a medal because you had to pay to enter, and you just got a medal to
Hmm.
do it. So I got that, but it's the only one I've done. It was one of those you do a couple smaller ones leading up to it, like the Breezy Point duathlon on the ocean base. I call it Norfolk Ocean Base. I think it's something different now, but the NOB in Norfolk, where the aircraft carriers and everything are, aircraft subs, other thing, big military base. And then I did one in Richmond. The Breezy Point was a triathlon, so it had the swimming too. And then the one in Richmond was a duathlon, which was a run, bike, run. And those were in preparation for that half Ironman. And the one in Richmond was the hardest just because it was about 104, 105 the day of it. It
Mm.
was
Oh
ridiculously
my
hot,
goodness.
2 flat tires, but
Oh, wow. That's tough.
yeah, life is tough, but first world problems there.
Yeah, right.
The so writing then, what kind of space do you write in? Like where you write most often?
Well, behind me, this is my office at home. And so this is where I do tend to work, but because we have the capability of having laptops, I can write anywhere. I'll take it on the road. Sometimes I'll write at Panera, sometimes I'll write at a library. Sometimes actually if I really need to buckle down and get, 25, 3,000 words in a day, I might go to a library or just somewhere outside of the house where I don't hook into Wi-Fi and I'm not tempted to check my email or go on my socials or do anything like that. And I can just, bang on it for a couple of hours to get that word count in for the day. And
Is
I
that
don't
how
know.
you is that how you keep yourself motivated for writing, mainly by word count, or do you do topics or time or anything like that?
Usually by word count. I like to get a lot of people do it by the day. I like to get between 6 to 8,000 words a week in
Okay.
because sometimes I have things going on where I can't always do 2,000 words a day, but if I can get 1,000 words a day in, 1,500 words a day, and get that 6 to 8,000 in a week, then I like to stay on track. In the afternoons, I generally have to work with my son who is autistic, and when he comes home from school, he needs help with his homework. So I kind of shut down around the 3 o'clock time period and work with him the rest of the afternoon or run him to whatever activities or that sort of thing that he needs help with or going on. So that's part
Yeah.
of the reason why I do the writing because it provides me the flexibility to work with him. When he was much younger, I honestly had much less time to do the writing because he needed so much more of my time with therapies and that sort of thing.
Do you do mainly full length novels, or do you do any novellas or other short stories or things?
So I do have a romance novella that's about, I think that's between 20 and 25,000 words. Most of mine are long, full length, 70 to 90,000 words. And I did start writing short stories about 2 years ago, and I have had three published. I think I've written five, and so far three have gotten out there into the world. So um, I find that a very difficult thing to do because I'm a long, what I call a long distance writer, as opposed to a short distance sprinter. Um,
Hmm.
I like having that space, and as you say, timeline. I like having that time that you can put into a novel. When you do a 5,000 word short story, you like really have to condense it and focus on this one point in time, and make the whole mystery happen. Now I do have one that just recently got published this summer in an anthology called First Comes Love, Then Comes Murder. And it's 19 juicy tales of, you know, murders happening, sometimes at weddings, sometimes at mine's from a cheating husband and he dies, and there's kind of a mystery as how he dies. So, you know, sometimes people have to die.
It's
um,
like in the heat of the night, somebody died every week in Sparta.
right, exactly. So, that does take place over a couple of days, but it's also a little bit longer. I think that's about 8,000 words, I think. 7 or 8,000 words. But some of these like magazines and things, you got to stick to 5,000 and under, so you really have to hone in. And some of these folks who write flash fiction, which is even shorter, it's like a couple hundred words. I can't seem to get a story in a couple of hundred words. I don't know. I'm just not trained to do it maybe, or my brain doesn't think that tightly or skilled to make that happen. So I don't know how to wrap up. I don't know how to have, a murder, find the clues, and wrap that up in a couple hundred words. So I'm
Yeah,
amazed
I
at
think
people who do.
you got to approach the flash fiction like you're telling a joke to somebody.
Yeah.
It's got to be a quick story. With
Hmm.
the short stories, did you find that affected either good or bad, like with your longer form writing? Did it help
Um,
with prose or descriptions or dialogue?
hmm, I hadn't really thought about it that way. I tend to, when I've written the short stories, it's because I'm writing for an anthology or a theme that I've read about. I haven't just written a short story and been like, "Hey, I'm gonna write this short story." It's more like I'm either writing for an anthology that's already that I know is already being produced and I want to submit for it, or maybe a magazine that I heard about was looking for X type of short stories, and so I was just writing to something that I had learned about. I don't know that it helps with the prose. It certainly, I mean, you have to keep it tight. It is helping me keep it much tighter, but I also tend to write them over the summertime, when my son is home from school, because I do not have as much writing time over the summer when he's home. I'm shuffling him around a lot more often and spending time doing things with him. So that's when I kind of get those short stories in because they go a little bit quicker and they don't need as much focus as far as writing a timeline and doing as much research and everything. I tend to keep them modern day as well. I think it's easier, and I don't think, I know it's faster and easier for me to write when I'm writing contemporary modern day because you don't have to do as much research. I mean, you know how a cell phone works, you know how what things look like. That's one of the things when you're writing in historical fiction, you're researching, you're like, hold on a second, what does this look like? I remember there's a part about the horse, and I'm like, well, what did the tack look like during that time? What did a currycomb look like? And I remember going down a rabbit hole for like 2 hours, and I remember thinking, I only have like 2 or 3 sentences to write. What am I doing, wasting so much time trying to figure this out?
Yeah, writing on assignment different than just the idea occurs and then you can't help but write it out. That's how most of my short stories are.
Mm,
And if you don't give it that attention right then, it's hard to come back to it. You end up with a list
right.
of short story ideas in your notebook or phone or whatever that one day I'll make a book about short story ideas. That's just pages of short story ideas that I never wrote. But I do find that it helps me with short story, with the pacing of a book,
Mm,
because I'm so honed in on this one event for a
hmm.
short story.
Hmm.
And then you can look at that as chapters or either a storyline through a larger story that you're just coming to every now and then. So you're like, okay, I have 5 pages now to talk about this storyline. And then the next time is going to be 20 pages from now. And you can pull that apart and make its own little short story. And then you have to separate it to put it into the larger one. I found that script writing or playwriting
Hmm.
helps a whole lot with dialogue to a certain point, but
Hmm.
more on thinking about description. It's so much easier to write exterior
Mhm.
grocery store night than it
Mhm.
is to write that in a novel.
Right.
And you can get along with the story much quicker. So for me, it teaches me to think differently. And I'm glad I've tried it. I haven't finished a script or published a script or anything like that, but I've worked on it enough to know that it makes me better, I feel like, at writing. And then poetry, I find, helps more with lyricism and ideas, but also mainly with dialogue, because you want your dialogue to mean something and you keep reducing it, reducing it, reducing it. And when you're working in poetry, you're trying to get those thoughts across in a shorter time frame, but also a little more poetically, if you will.
Right.
So it's you got to get that the way people's voice is and their personality comes out a lot more when you think about them along a poetic time or a poetic setting or state of mind. I don't know. It's like watching Justified, that TV show based on the books, and the way they talk in it. I really like the way they talk. And when
Mhm.
you watch the series, I have a note section in my phone that just has quotes that I really like from it. And you go, oh, that's pretty good.
Mhm.
So you just have to realize that. And then you think, did the writer put that much thought into it? And they had to have. They had to have. Like, there's nothing you put in the book that you didn't really think about. So
Right.
it's, I think that also changes the way you read books, the way you look at, listen to music, the way you watch TV when you're a writer, is because you know that there's a reason for all those things. And you get frustrated when you find out there isn't. And then that's when you can tell, well, that's sloppy. It seems sloppy to waste your time with that. But
Mhm.
it takes all kinds.
I agree. And actually, so the script writing, that's interesting that you brought that up. I've started working on a script myself. And again, I'm finding myself, as you said, you have to make it very simple. Like you said, night, exterior, you know, bedroom, and
Hmm.
that's all. You don't describe what the bedroom looks like. You don't say the curtains were blue and that sort of thing. Um, and it is tough, and like you said, you really focus on the dialogue. You really have to get across your story through dialogue and action. So there isn't a lot of description. There isn't what you do when you're long prose novels, and I think it's definitely a different type of writing. I will admit I'm struggling with it. And the other thing is you have to keep it, like if you're writing, you know that if you're writing a movie script, that's around 100 pages or so,
Hmm.
90 to
Page
120
a minute.
pages, and that's not even like full size pages. That's in like the final draft, the script pages where you have all this dialogue, then maybe some action and description, and for the shots and everything. So it's definitely different. Um,
Yeah.
I
I'd say
s-
it's like writing instructions, but I think it's more like writing suggestions, because the actor is going to look at it and go, well, I think this is the motivation of the character. And the
Mhm.
director is going to look at it a different way and think, this is what I think it's going to be like. But with your example of exterior, of night exterior bedroom, I think right then that's blowing my mind, because I'm thinking, what's an exterior bedroom look like? But
Oh.
that's a great beginning for a flash fiction thing. And
Mm,
I like finding those things you can write about as an exercise. You might never use it in anything, but
mhm.
just those little writing exercises that you can, if you hit your word count or time or topic, whatever you do for the day, and then you just jump into a little writing exercise, it can reinvigorate you, I find.
Yeah, that's true. I also tend to, um, like maybe I finished up, but I still have some time, so I'll maybe go on and create some promos for social media or something like that, because
Mm.
that's the other thing. We're always doing promotion for our work and everything. And you want to talk about, getting down to the meat of things, is describing your book in one sentence or less and make it
Mhm.
sound exciting for people. And then, put it on some sort of give some sort of graphic to make it interesting that people are actually going to want to click on it and then follow the link to and read more to purchase it and that sort of thing. So really getting down to, I think, and I've talked about this and have done a workshop on it, about blurbs and taglines and that sort of thing. And that I think can be very hard for an author to whittle down their entire story into one one or two lines, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I've worked with authors on doing this, um, to see, how can we do this? How can we sell it? Also, because you need to do it if you're writing a query letter to a publisher or an agent, and you need to be able to whittle that down, give them the meat of the story, make it exciting in just a couple of lines. So I think that more than anything can kind of help us whittle down to the simplistic point of what the story is about. And even with a script, you got to be able to write a log line so that if you're going to try and sell it, it's got to be something that's going to grab people so they'll look past the log line to read your script and see if they're interested in it. So I
Yeah.
think that can be a very difficult but good writing um, practice for us to try and get down to those simple, very simple forms of writing.
Yeah. I think with when you're developing log lines and treatments and proof of concepts, storyboards, all that, you're definitely looking more towards trying to get other people excited about it without having read it.
Hmm.
And my approach for books is kind of a more JD Salinger type approach, I think, which is on the back where you normally have a summary. I don't put anything.
Mm.
And just in the description, it's either this is poetry, this is adventure fiction, and maybe that's one reason why I've made tens of dollars writing. But it's I don't know. It's when you are you familiar with that movie, The Never Ending Story?
Yes.
Where so Atreyu, I think his name is,
Hmm.
where the kid that's reading it, there's nothing on the back of that book. You just
Right.
start reading it. You got to take it on faith. So that's asking a lot of people. But then I think it's also are you in it with the idea that you're going to make money, make a little money, make a lot of money? That's the great part about writing is you can do all those things. You can decide to market it as much as you want. It doesn't mean it's going to be successful, and you can decide to not market it at all, and it could be a hit. But I mean, it's certainly more likely to be successful if you market it. Marketing works.
Right.
With your publishing, I noticed in your bio it talked about a hybrid writer. Does that mean that you self-publish some and that you go through a publisher other times, or what does that mean?
Right. So I have traditionally published and independently published books. And not only that, I've been with small presses and a large traditional publisher. So I've kind of been down each one of the roads, and I mentor authors. And when I'm talking with them and mentoring them, we kind of talk about what their goals are. You know, what's your goal? Where do you see yourself? If you're going to go this way, do you need an agent? If you're happy with a small press, you don't always need an agent. You can go directly and submit to these small presses, and you know, you're still considered traditionally published, just might be with a small press. And some people like that boutique experience. And it's a little bit easier than getting an agent. And some people, I say, it can be a stepping stone for them. If you want to get an agent, maybe get published first and get that book out there, and then go for an agent and try and, you know, then try and get the bigger five, top five publishers. And then for some folks, if they are real go-getters and have a lot of time in their hands, I do recommend independently publishing. It all depends on where they want to go. For folks who have, heavy duty jobs and are working, 40, 50-hour weeks, I often tell them that it's probably going to be easier and better for them to go with a publisher, because then they don't have to do all the editing and all the work that comes with it. Obviously, you relinquish a lot of control with that as well. So, but if you don't have time to do everything that needs to be done to independently publish something, I do recommend. And I started out traditionally myself and then built a following. And so it was a little bit easier when I did start independently publishing some of my books, to go in that direction, because I had already developed a following and built a newsletter and that sort of thing.
Hmm. Is independent publishing self-publishing, like
Hmm.
on Amazon, KDP, or something like that?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I started off with I think you'd call it a vanity press, which is self-publishing, but you don't do all that you pay for someone else to do the cover, and you can give them ideas. They do the formatting,
Okay.
and you can tell them what you want, and then they send it back to you, and then you have to okay it. I'm glad I had the experience. I don't think I would do that again. And I haven't had the experience of like a big publishing house saying, look, we want to put you on tour. We want to do all your stuff. We're going to edit it. We're going to handle everything. You just give us this manuscript. We're going to give you this lunchbox of money up front so you can have some to
Yeah.
live
Yeah, that
on.
doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. I haven't had
You
that
know,
experience.
unless you are someone or you slept with someone, as my agent once said, they're not giving you a big lunchbox of money. It's
Hmm.
sad, and actually, as it's developed, even in the past, well, 10 years, dozen years, since my first publication, the money is even less. If you read about in the publishing industry, the main New York Times bestsellers that they've got at their houses are the ones keeping the houses going. Um, when editors take on new authors, they're hoping, for that New York Times number one New York Times bestseller, and they're hoping that it will make it. But a lot of them say, "Well, I love the book, and hopefully we can make a go of it." But they really don't do, um, they're not doing tours for you.
Yeah.
Um, they might invite you to a particular event that's big book publishing event that might be happening, and have you come and do some signing or something like that. But if you want to go on tour, maybe they'll give you a little bit of support. They certainly do a big push at the beginning of when your book comes out, but they expect you also as a publisher, I mean, as a writer, to do a lot of your own marketing as well. So, when you work
Yeah.
together, and some folks hire marketing experts. I've certainly hired some marketing folks myself. But that's also like throwing spaghetti at a wall. Sometimes it works, and sometimes you don't see an ROI from it.
Yeah. It's I get plenty of calls and emails from people that are like, "Hey, do you want to come to this book fair and do a book signing here or pitch your book to a movie producer to have a script written?" I go, "Sure. I mean, who's doing the booking? Who do I need to talk to for the bookings? What kind of hotel are you booking me in, and who's paying for travel?" And I haven't had anybody yet that said anything other than I'm paying for everything,
Right.
like me, the writer. So
Yeah.
I've done a couple book events at libraries,
Hmm.
local things, but never any huge things. With publishing, then, what do you find one way that you like better than the other, or does it depend on what you're publishing, and has your feelings about it changed through time?
Um, well, I will tell you, I enjoy the control of indie publishing. Um, I have I have a team. I have a I have some cover artists that I work with. I have an editor that she's wonderful, and then some folks that do some marketing for me, and I do a lot of my own marketing as well. And I work with different people. So if you're going to do it, you need to have a plan, you need to have a team, you need to have a timeline. Talk back to timelines. You need to have a timeline about what you're doing, when you're doing, the lead up to the launch, and then what you're doing after the launch. And so now I kind of have it going. Um, I don't want to say it's working like a machine, but
You
because,
can say that. Go ahead.
well, things constantly change though. Like algorithms when you're running ads on social media or Amazon or anything, they're constantly changing. So trying to keep up with that can be difficult.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes I'll find that ads that I used to run like 2 or 3 years ago, if I try running those ads now, I get nothing. I just don't get any sort of payout on them. So it's always a changing environment. And then now we're struggling, I think, to deal with AI. And I'm sure you've read about how lots of AI has been trained on books without authors say so at all. And I know for the bigger publishers, they're actually putting these things into their contracts as to, you know, their books being able to be trained for their AI systems. A lot of writers are saying, no, my feeling is, it's going to happen. We can't stop it. AI is out there. I wouldn't be surprised if my books had already been, some of them had already been used to train AI. And I want to get paid for it. If you're going to use my book to train your AI, pay me for it. It's like optioning my audio rights or optioning my, movie rights or something. Option my AI rights.
Hmm.
Let's talk money. Because even though, this is a job that I enjoy doing, I do need to make money off of it. So you can't just steal my stuff for your AI training.
Yeah. A lot of the way I look at AI is like it's a person. It's it's learning like a person learns. It's just learning more
Faster.
quickly than
Mhm.
a person ever will. So
Mhm.
it's a strange thing that's being created. That maybe that's why we're here is to create the AI. But that might be a different conversation. Another mystery. What's what's the best way for people to follow your work?
Well, they can probably the best way to find me is at my website, which is ellenbutler.net. And I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook at Ellen Butler Books and Instagram at eButlerBooks. Um, I'm not on Twitter or TikTok at this time, but those are probably the best ways to find my books. And then you can always go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble and Kobo and just look up Ellen Butler author, and I generally come up, and you can find my mysteries and historical fiction and
I
my
have those
romances.
links. Oh, okay. I have those links in the show notes as well as some of the, I think a Goodreads link and a BookBud link. But your website,
Yes.
Facebook, and Instagram are there in case people want to check that out.
Great.
Thank you very much for your time. Any thoughts in closing?
I just think that so many people come up to me and say, "Oh, I've got a great idea," and they tell me their idea, and I'm like, "Well, that's great." And they're like, "Well, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that?" And I say, "That's great. I think you should sit down and write it. That's the best advice I can give you right now. Get your butt in seat and write through it, because an idea is nothing until it's on paper and you can do something with it and you can edit it and you can talk with other people about it and say, I've got this book, I got this idea, I've got these things out there. Where can I go from now?" So I think that's my piece of advice. If you've got an idea and you want to become a writer, sit down, put your put your hands on the keys and let it flow.
Very nice. Thank you for your time. I'll talk to you after this.
Great, thank you.